This monitor is something I never thought I'd actually own, and honestly, I'm still a bit surprised it even exists. The Asus PG27 AQDP is 480Hz and 1440p on an OLED panel. It's a surreal list of specs, and just to get the obvious out of the way, it's amazing. That goes without saying, but this has managed to be simultaneously both the best and worst experience I've had with a new monitor. It's certainly not perfect, and I've had a lot of issues with it, some of which I haven't heard discussed in any reviews as of writing this. Issues that honestly might have gotten me to wait for firmware updates or look for alternative options before paying the asking price of $1,000. But before I talk about that, I think it's important to answer the question of who this monitor is actually for, and maybe more importantly, should you actually buy it? For high-end monitors like this one, there are two very common concerns. One, can you actually see that high refresh rate? And two, who is getting that many frames? And to get the first one out of the way, yes, you absolutely can. Coming from my old 240Hz monitor, this was a massive upgrade and honestly just felt unreal to use. Obviously, it isn't a linear improvement, it doesn't look twice as good as 240Hz, but it still is a significant difference. Even 480Hz compared to 360Hz is a visible upgrade, not a massive one, but it's noticeable and I appreciated it a lot in stuff like CS2, Valorant, Overwatch 2, or even aim trainers. I beat a lot of my scores in Kovacs without too much effort, mostly because of how much smoother everything looked. Anything that was consistently getting above that 480 FPS threshold was just amazing to play. And on top of how good high refresh rate displays already feel, this monitor is an OLED. Of course, the colors are amazing here, but what I appreciated the most about OLED was its pixel response times. On most monitors, there's a bit of delay for each pixel when changing colors. It's not major, but can cause some ghosting or artifacting, but here, those response times are instant, which removes all of those issues. This combined with the screen's 1440p resolution was an unbelievable upgrade in clarity. I didn't think 1440p would matter that much. I knew it was good for editing and general PC use, but for FPS games, I thought I'd just use this monitor at 1080p. But honestly, it kind of makes 1080p look terrible. The image as a whole is so much sharper at 1440p, and it actually helped a lot more than I expected in games. Reading the movements of further away targets felt much easier thanks to that boost in clarity, and aiming at them felt like aiming at a player instead of just a collection of pixels, and can give this monitor a slight edge over things like the 540Hz Zowie monitor, even in esports titles. Compared to my old 240Hz IPS monitor, even when running at the same refresh rate, this monitor produces an image that is so much cleaner, it honestly would make sense to upgrade from a monitor like that to a modern OLED 1440p 240Hz panel. So why didn't I? I don't actually get 480 FPS in most of the games I play, so what motivated me to go with this display over a 360 or 240Hz one? Of course, being able to see those extra frames in some games is nice, especially since I do take FPS games more seriously, and future-proofing is a great argument too. When I do upgrade my PC, I'll be able to take advantage of this monitor in more games, but what could completely fix this issue and really sold me on this display specifically was ELMB. For anyone who hasn't heard of ELMB, this technology is called heaps of different things, but they all work mostly in the same way, which is temporarily cutting off light from the monitor after each frame is shown to reduce motion blur. This means that when using this, there isn't actually a continuous stream of frames, but a bit of an image and a bit of black before another image. You won't actually see this though. All the black does is basically trick our eyes into seeing less motion blur than there otherwise would be. And the results look pretty impressive. It makes 120Hz look pretty close to what 240Hz does normally, and 240Hz now looks about as clear as 480Hz without actually needing to get those frames. Unfortunately, OLEDs can't do this, at least not properly. Usually, monitors will cut off the back half of their frames, so a conventional 240Hz monitor with support for this technology will still be 240Hz with it enabled. But since this isn't possible on OLEDs, they have to put a full black frame in between each normal frame instead, which is called black frame insertion or BFI. So on a 240Hz OLED, you could only get 120Hz BFI, but on this panel, 240Hz BFI is possible, which, like I said, is what sold me on this monitor. While I wouldn't use it over 480Hz in esports titles because of the loss of smoothness, if I could get 480Hz equivalent visual clarity in any game I can run above 240 FPS, it'd be perfect. And it works. The image it outputs looks significantly better than normal 240Hz, comparable to 480Hz, just like the test showed. And that's 480Hz on an OLED, which is already clearer than conventional 500Hz panels. But ELMB ended up being the biggest disappointment of this monitor for me. When using it, my first impression was that it just felt off, and after a few minutes, I was convinced it had additional input lag versus non-ELMB 240Hz. I've seen a few different tests since that both ballpark a 4 to 5 millisecond latency increase, which doesn't sound terrible, but when the base input lag is so low, it felt very noticeable to me. Capping my FPS to 240 in-game did make it feel more responsive, but if the frames dipped at all below that 240 FPS mark, it'd create very visible screen tearing, which for me was more detrimental than the blur would have been. Especially since faster paced action is usually what causes it to dip, which is also when you really don't want screen tearing. And that's not even mentioning the other issues this mode has. It drops the screen's brightness significantly, which wasn't a deal breaker for me, but certainly could be if you usually play in a very well lit room. Both VRR and HDR are not compatible with this setting, and I've seen some people talk about experiencing eye strain from it, but I haven't experienced this myself. It still works great in slower paced or single player games, and I'm sure it's still an option I'll use a lot, even in some faster paced shooters, but it certainly isn't the no compromises perfect solution I thought it would be. As for whether this can still justify getting this monitor over a less expensive 240 or 360Hz OLED equivalent, I think it depends on your use case. If you mostly play games below 480 FPS, I wouldn't get this monitor just because it is an OLED with 240Hz ELMB. I think at that point, it's just not worth the money. With that said, when it works, it's incredible. In Apex Legends, it basically is what I thought it would be because of how stable my FPS is in that game, and it does offer a significantly better experience than native 240Hz, and I still have hope that the issues I've encountered will get addressed by ASUS through a firmware patch in the future, if possible. The other big question I've seen from a lot of people about this display is its size. 27 inches isn't huge when compared to other high-end monitors, but a lot of people are looking at this as an upgrade from a conventional 24-inch esports monitor, and I was one of those people. I've seen a lot of discussion about how larger monitors can impact aim, with the main concern being that the distances you need to move your mouse relative to the distance your crosshair travels within your peripheral vision completely changes. Even though your sensitivity will be the same, it will still feel a bit different, and I kind of get the concern. It did feel a bit strange at first, but honestly I think this difference is somewhat overblown. It didn't take me long to adjust to it all, and 27 inches has some benefits for aiming as well. I think it contributed to that feeling I mentioned earlier, where I was aiming at player models now instead of pixels, and it made my bad eyesight feel like a bit less of a hindrance in games. I don't see the size of this monitor being a noteworthy issue unless you're one of those people who gets close enough to smell it, but even then, it does have a mode to display a 24-inch image with black borders at the correct resolution for 1:1 pixel scaling, so it won't look blurry if this is something super important to you. And I do think this is a worthy upgrade if you're currently running an older conventional esports display. There is a caveat to this aspect control feature though, and it links back to those problems I talked about in the intro, which is that half the features on this monitor just don't work sometimes. This isn't even things like 5 ms extra input latency in one specific mode. I'm talking about major issues like 480Hz and 1440p not being able to run simultaneously sometimes for seemingly no reason, or options on the on-screen display being randomly grayed out, making them inaccessible until it decides to fix itself. There was one time half the OSD just vanished and I couldn't use it. And even without looking at major issues like these, there were so many minor inconveniences. The firmware update tool can't find my display, and the only way to fix it was to unplug every USB from my computer. When using my old 1080p second monitor, alt-tabbing was taking almost 30 seconds every time, so I had to swap that monitor out too, and even after that, alt-tabbing is still pretty slow. Some older games have just made the monitor stop working until the game was turned off. That aspect control setting I mentioned earlier reset both my main and second monitor's settings every single time I would change it, and let's not talk about whatever the fuck's going on here. I get that pushing boundaries in tech will always come with issues, but I feel the level of troubleshooting and fine-tuning I've had to go through to get an $1,000 monitor to perform smoothly with no bugs is frankly absurd. There is also a chance I just got extremely unlucky and this experience isn't the norm, or that this is somehow on me for doing something wrong, and I have had others with this monitor say that I have been particularly unfortunate, but considering that I've never had anything like this happen with any other monitor, and that one of the review sites I used as a source earlier in the video mentioned they couldn't test aspect control because it wouldn't work for them, I don't think this is user error here. To bring things back to the question I asked at the start of the video, who is this monitor for? Probably not that many people. There are a lot of things working in its favor, but it's still hard to argue that this monitor is a good deal. Usually after going up in refresh rate, I found it very hard to go back down, but I wouldn't struggle to go to 360Hz after trying 480. It's still more than good enough for esports titles, and when you consider that a 360Hz 1440p OLED would still offer amazing motion and picture clarity for barely over half the price at the time I checked, it seems much more appealing. And that's just in esports titles for people who take FPS games more seriously. 240Hz is still an amazing refresh rate that will be more than good enough for most people and opens up the option of a higher resolution monitor too if that's something you're interested in. But if you are like me, there really isn't a better option. I want those insanely high refresh rates at high resolutions for the games I can reach that in both now and maybe in the future after a PC upgrade, but I also want good visual fidelity and colors for slower paced shooters and story-focused single-player games, while also having great text clarity and enough screen space for general PC tasks. And there isn't anything else around right now that checks all those boxes to a higher level than this. The high refresh rate Zowies are nowhere near as color accurate and are still 1080p, and the 240Hz OLED just isn't fast enough to justify upgrading to when I play as many esports games as I do. And considering that this is something I'll use almost every day for the next 5 years or so, despite all the issues and bugs I've had with it and the absurd price tag, I still really like this monitor. The experience it offers when actually using it is just unmatched. For me, I think it was worth the money and I'm happy with my purchase, and I think if you sit in a similar niche to me, you would be too. It still might be worth waiting for those firmware patches though. Something I've kind of had to skim over in this video for time reasons was how high hertz impacts aim in more detail. People have a cursory understanding of it just from intuition, but I think the nuances of the topic are kind of underexplored. So I made an 18-minute long bonus video that's available for free over on my Patreon. If you want to give it a watch, it's linked in the pinned comment, and I hope you enjoy. This bot feels significantly easier on 240Hz compared to 120, just since it's so much easier to read the changes the bot makes to its own trajectory mid-direction change through that acceleration. On 60Hz though, those are all mushed into a single screen refresh, or so few refreshes that I can't read the deceleration as a gradient of speed, but instead a few jagged points of disconnected information. If I've made you interested in this monitor or some other OLED options, I've got a few Amazon affiliate links for some that I recommend below. Any purchases made with them will support me and what I make, but I'm not affiliated with any of the companies who make those monitors. Special thanks to my Patreons for encouraging this purchase, and thanks for watching.